Dan wants to know if the third heaven, also called paradise a couple of lines later, is what we commonly think of as heaven. What are the first and second heavens?
Yeah, it's actually all of the above. We have to remember when we get into this that heaven doesn't have literal geography. There's no latitude and longitude. There's no literal levels or stages, as though when you were in one, you could measure their size or their distance from each other. Okay, so we have to be careful that we don't overly literalize the language when it talks about heaven or these levels of heaven and so on and so forth. I mean, they're all this other place, and they're spoken of in these ways to distinguish parts of them. And again, we are forced to use the language of space. We are forced to use spatial language, the language of embodiment and physicality, to talk about a spiritual realm that doesn't actually have those things, because it's not the world of our experience and our embodiment. But the only way we can talk about those other things is to use the language of our experience and of our embodiment. This is just always the way it is in Scripture and in our own discussions. So, with that in mind, the levels language is trying to communicate that the presence of God Himself, like where the presence is in the spiritual world, that spot, as it were, and realize we can't even speak of God in that way correctly, because that makes God a spatial being. But God is omnipresent. Okay, you see the problem we have of even using this language, but I'm just going to try to wade through it because that's what we have to do. So the levels language is trying to communicate that the presence of God is the holiest place in the spiritual world. God occupies, in Paul's language, the third level. There are some ancient texts from the Second Temple period that have three levels of heaven. 2 Corinthians 12:2 is what the question is really deriving from. Other texts have seven levels. You say, well, why is it different? You know what? Well, they're all trying to communicate the same idea, that at the highest level, the seventh level, or the third level, the place where God is at, that's the holiest spot, the holiest place. The language tries to parse out where we are in the spiritual realm, where other objects are in the spiritual realm, and then where God Himself is in the spiritual realm. And so it has to use this level language to do that. Again, to make sure that God is given the preeminent place. He is the preeminent being in this plane of reality, the spiritual world. Again, it's just a way of establishing, to use a Levitical way of expressing it, gradations of holiness. If you think about the temple, the tabernacle and the temple, there were the more inward you went, the greater the sanctity. Okay, so that you couldn't have non-priests occupy like the first level of sacred space. I mean, they could bring a sacrifice up to the gate or the door of the tabernacle, and it would be sacrificed, but they couldn't go beyond a certain point. Then priests could go there, but there was a subset of those priests who could go into the holy place, and then there's only one priest that could actually go into the most holy place, the Holy of Holies, once a year. This was designed to teach and to reinforce the idea that the ground gets holier, okay, the closer to God that you are. It's these gradations of holiness. We talked about this in Leviticus about what's done with the blood and all this kind of stuff and who can go where. It's the same idea sort of transferred into the spiritual realm when you get these levels of heaven. There's a lot of speculation in Second Temple period literature. You get all these heavenly visions and journeys of individuals like Enoch and Abraham and Baruch and so on and so forth. There's a number of Old Testament characters that have these journeys, and you get this language, that as they're on their trip, so to speak, to see the presence of God, you pass through certain levels, these heavenly levels, and it's designed again to teach the idea that the closer to God you get, the more sanctified the space is, the more holy it is. I personally think the three-level approach is probably modeled after the temple. You have the court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. You got three levels there. The 7 levels, again, my suspicion is that it has something to do with the number 7 being perceived or thought about as perfection. And you say, well, how do you get 7 in perfection? Well, it's modeled after the creation week, that everything is created in 6 days, and on the 7th day God rests in his temple, which is, in Genesis, which is, Eden on earth, that it completes the activity. This is what God wanted to do. He did, and he did it, exactly the way he wanted to do it. So you've got this perception, this idea, this numerical tag, as it were, number 7, that speaks of completeness and in that sense, perfection. So I tend to think that number is used again to convey the same idea, and I think that the number 3, as we're speaking of levels, is really drawn more from sacred space on the ground, boots on the ground, so to speak, that we read about in the Old Testament.